Yeah, so my name is Jannik. I'm super excited to be here. I will present our paper, Semantic Uncertainty in Large Language Models. I think that's not really the title. I think just what you just said is the title. And I thought before I begin, it might make sense to give just a brief intro of who I am and how I have how I'm now standing here, which is, I think this is definitely the biggest talk I've ever given. So it's really exciting. So now, since about 7 months or so, I am an AI research scientist at Meta Fair, working in a team that does code generation with LLMs. I'm working remotely from Berlin, and our team is kind of based all over Europe. Before that, I was a PhD student, where I've worked on, I think uncertainties and data efficiency in vision and language models is maybe the overarching theme. I've really worked on quite a few different things. And from that work as a PhD student, today I will be talking about our paper on detecting hallucinations in LLMs using semantic entropy. I think this is the title now. I will also talk about some follow-up work, which is called Semantic Entropy Probes. Again, I don't think that's the title, but it's something like that. Because I think the follow-up work is also really cool, and it raises some interesting questions about LLMs and their uncertainties. I've interned a bunch at DeepMind and Google, and I originally did study physics. So I did an undergrad in physics in Bremen, and then a graduate degree in physics in Heidelberg. And I've kind of slowly pivoted to machine learning. Well, the pivot is complete, I would say. Maybe it's been completed for 5 years or so, but from 2013 to 2020, there was definitely like some slow pivot from physics to ML. All right, so this time, that's the title. Detecting Hallucinations in LLMs using Semantic Entropy is a paper that got published at Nature sometime last summer, which was super exciting for us. Like, the paper got picked up by news outlets all over the world, like Time Magazine, Science, The Washington Post, Yahoo News, so, all the big ones. And this is a collaboration with friends and colleagues who were at Oxford at the time, or still are at Oxford. I think Yarin is still at Oxford. Lorenz is at OpenAI, and Seb, I don't really know. I think Seb is like somewhere between DeepMind and Oxford. So, I mean, I'm super grateful for them really letting me help out on this project. And yeah, they've made big contributions to this work, so I definitely want to shout them out here. This isn't just my doing. All right, so let's briefly set the stage. What is a hallucination? I think you're probably all aware, but for those that aren't, LLMs, we like using them. They're very useful, but sometimes they produce plausible sounding, but factually incorrect generations. And this can be fine. Like, if you're just playing around with the LLM, that's fine. But people tend to trust them, and people tend to use them in really high stakes scenarios. Things like medicine, legal applications, or journalism. And so I think for these cases, we really need some method to detect hallucinations. I think will argue that this should take the form of an uncertainty or a certainty indicator. Like, I think it would be really nice if every time the model tells us something, we would have some sort of signal as to how certain the model is about its generation. And that's exactly what I'll talk about. So I will start with a real-world example of a hallucination with the, at the time, state-of-the-art model, GPT-4. It would be kind of interesting if we would still get hallucinations with the current generation of models. I'll leave that as homework. So we're asking the model here who Yarin Gal is. Yarin was my supervisor, and we get this paragraph about Yarin. And that paragraph contains many true things. Like, Yarin is an associate professor. He does specialize in deep and Bayesian learning. He's at Christchurch. I'm sure he's won awards and grants. So it looks quite good at first glance, but if you really know Yarin, you know that there's a bunch of stuff in here that's wrong. So our group is not called the Uncertainty and Machine Learning Group, although maybe that would be a better name than the Oxford Applied and Theoretical Machine Learning Group. And Yarin also hasn't founded any startups that I know of. And if he did, I really hope he wouldn't go with Oxbridge AI, which is possibly the worst startup name that anyone could come up with. And so how can we then detect these hallucinations? Because I think we really need to. Well, it turns out that, intuitively speaking, when LLMs don't know, they tend to just make stuff up arbitrarily. And that's the surprising, maybe, but empirically quite reliably true phenomenon that we will exploit with semantic entropy. And I mean, I'll discuss formally or more formally what I mean by all of this. But maybe let's first see this in action at the example of this Yarin startup. So what we'll do is we'll take this generation about Yarin startup and simply ask the model again. So here in this instance, we create this prompt where we kind of want the model to tell us about Yarin startup again. So we have a bit of an intro here, and then we ask it, does Yarin have any significant entrepreneurial endeavors related to his fields of expertise? Then we ask that GPT-4, and GPT-4 says, yes, co-founder of the AI startup Oxbotica. Okay, as maybe even worse name. And then we ask GPT-4 again, just same question, sample from the model. And this time GPT-4 says, yes, he co-founded OxAI. We ask again, and it says OxAI again. So we have Oxbridge AI, Oxbotica, OxAI. Maybe we shouldn't trust the model. It clearly has no idea what the name of Yarin's startup is if it tells us something different every time. And that's the fundamental and very, very simple idea behind semantic entropy. Although, we are going to try and do a decent amount to formalize this idea in the language of uncertainty quantification. But as practical advice, if you're ever using an LLM, just ask it like 2 or 3 times. And if it tells you different things, don't trust it. Although there's some caveats to this, like if you don't know the, temperature at which you're generating or what's been done to the underlying LLM, it could be that this works not as well as it does with a vanilla model. All right, so kind of diving into semantic uncertainty a little bit more. If you have some experience in machine learning, you might be wondering, hey, these LLMs, they are probabilistic generative models. So I do get probabilities when I generate with them. Like they do give me the probability, the joint probability of the tokens that they generate. Why don't I just use that uncertainty? And the problem with that is that they are language models and that language is complicated. And in particular, if we look at just the uncertainties on the tokens, we cannot differentiate between a model that has many different things to say and a model that has many ways to say the same thing. So I'm not an expert in NLP by any means, but I think a more precise way to state this would be that token level uncertainties conflate meaning with syntax and lexis. And we really care about the uncertainty in the meaning. Like if you look at this example on the right, it's a very simple educational example, but you ask the model, where is the Eiffel Tower? And you sample a bunch of answers and you get the answers Paris, it's Paris, France is capital Paris, Rome, it's Rome, Berlin. And you would just look at the uncertainties on the token distribution, then you might conclude that this model is very uncertain because it's giving you all these different answers. But in fact, the first 3 answers mean the same, answers 4 and 5 also mean the same, and answer 5 stands on its own. And so what you really want to do and that's the high-level idea of semantic entropy, is to aggregate these token-level probabilities across clusters where all generations mean the same. I think Eiffel Tower, maybe that example is a bit outdated. I think most models would know by now, but that's the idea here. And this will work for more complicated things as well, of course. So these are the high-level steps for computing semantic entropy. And for now, we will kind of keep to these simple sentence length generations of the model. And later we will revisit this paragraph scenario that we had initially, right? I asked about Yari, we got a whole paragraph. We will later talk about how we can compute semantic entropy in those scenarios. So the first step is very simple. We sample m generations at a high temperature. We actually sample one more generation at low temperature so that we can assess the model's accuracy on that question. Then we cluster generations by their semantic equivalence, and then using that clustering and the token level probabilities, we compute semantic entropy. Okay, so before I go into the details of how we compute these steps, I would like to talk a bit about the scope of this method. So what can we do with semantic entropy? Ideally, and we find quite reliably, it can help us identify questions to which an LLM is likely to give a wrong response by giving us this entropy or uncertainty signal. And then we can use that to maybe refuse to answer questions or even trigger human intervention. So what really is a hallucination? I mean, I've been a bit imprecise about the term. And originally, LLM hallucinations were defined in this context of summarization tasks, where models fail to extract what is given in a context and instead make stuff up. So they would call something a hallucination even if it was correct, but it would be a hallucination just because it didn't appear in the context. So I think we no longer do that. And now, essentially, hallucinations has come to, as a term, has come to encompass like a whole host of model failures, and it's kind of 1 - accuracy. In the paper, we differentiate between confabulations and hallucinations. I'm not really going to do that during the talk, so if you know the paper, maybe you'll be upset with me like a little bit. And we do that in the paper because there are cases where semantic entropy will just straight up fail, because it only relies on the model. And the model might sometimes produce incorrect responses very confidently. Luckily, I don't really see that happen very much when using models in practice. But there are some very simple scenarios you can think of where this would happen. Like, let's say the US elects a new president. The model doesn't yet know about this. The model will tell you the old president very confidently. But because the facts of who the president is have now changed, you could call that a hallucination, and we would not be able to detect that with semantic entropy. And so I think in practice, you'd probably want to combine uncertainty-based methods like semantic entropy with other methods such as retrieval-based augmentation, RAG-based hallucination detection methods, stuff like that. Another side note, and then I promise I'll talk about how to calculate semantic entropy. I think it's quite remarkable that LLM uncertainties are this good, because this is not at all what we're used from with vision models, for example. Like, I am very used to vision, like classification models, being confident and wrong when you give them inputs from domains they haven't seen before. And you can get them to have good uncertainties, but this usually involves a lot of work. And so the fact that LLMs seem to know what they don't know is quite remarkable to me. And in that sense, I kind of see hallucinations as more of a blessing than a curse, because it means that while, yes, these models don't know everything, they know when they don't know. And we can use that to provide uncertainty signals, to maybe refuse to answer. And we could very plausibly be living in a world where these models get things wrong confidently. And then we'd be in a much, much worse situations. So I'm happy that we have hallucinations. Okay, So let's talk in detail about the computation of semantic entropy. As I already kind of said, the first step really is just sample M sequences at high temperature. So this can really be, depends a bit on the model, but let's say like 0.8 and you have your top P95, like really standard, you just sample from the model a bit. And as I said, we also sample one generation at low temperature to assess accuracy. And because we generate entire sentences, we then use an LLM to assess accuracy. So we compare the generation of the model with the ground truth answer. And for most of the data sets, the ground truth answer is just, a word or two, but then our generation is a sentence. So you can't use these old school n-gram based overlap metrics, you can use them, they don't work that well. So we rely on another LLM to assess accuracy. Okay. Slightly more exciting is the next step, where we cluster generations by semantic equivalence. And this really is quite straightforward, despite the scary looking algorithm maybe. The idea is for each generation to compare it to all previous clusters and generations. And if a generation means the same thing as a generation from an existing cluster, we just add it to that cluster. And if a generation doesn't mean the same thing as generations from any existing cluster, we open a new cluster. So we just kind of have all the generations, we take the first one, there's no existing clusters, so we create a new cluster. We go to the second generation, we compare it to the first generation in the first cluster. Does it mean the same? Yes, we add it to that cluster. Doesn't mean the same? No, we open a new cluster. We take the third generation, compare it to the first generation, the first cluster, second generation, the second cluster, and I think you get the idea. So really, it's quite simple. There is a deeper problem here, though, which is what does it mean for two generations to mean the same thing? Luckily, there's been some work on that. There is a whole host of NLP papers on natural language inference. And the generally accepted consensus is that two generations mean the same when they entail each other bidirectionally. So if generation A entails generation B and generation B entails generation A, then they mean the same thing. And entailment is like the right arrow you probably know from like math lectures. A side note, we originally just used DeBerta models. It's like a BERT variant for those old enough to remember that is fine-tuned to directly predict entailment. But we found that this didn't really work as we moved to longer generations. And so we switched to just prompting an LLM, and we found that works considerably better, which I guess is the way things are. Nothing you can do about that. And we also don't do strict entailment for longer generations. So we don't require A entailing B and B entailing A. We are sometimes happy if one entails the other and then the other doesn't contradict the one. So you can have entailment, neutral, or contradiction. And we're happy if there's no contradiction in the second one. And that's because when we move to these longer answers, sometimes the models will just add filler. They'll add all these extra bits and pieces that you won't find in both generations exactly. And if you require strict entailment, that will kind of screw you then, because then almost nothing will be exactly equivalent. But you don't have to worry about that too much. Cool. Now the exciting bit, computing semantic entropy. So a quick refresher on the probabilistics of LLMs. Maybe a quick show of hands. I'm assuming you all know what an LLM, like a transformer, looks like. Show of hands. Yes, exactly. Up for yes. Yeah. Well, there was some non-hands. I feel very sorry for you. I don't know if I can make that up. So when we generate a sequence S with a transformer in a forward pass through the model, we will get the joint probability of the tokens that we've generated. This is that first line, right? So I think a lot of us maybe just use the model and we just look at the next token probability at the last input position of the transformer, right? To sample the next token. But actually the transformer gives us these next token predictions at every input position. And so if you do a forward pass through a transformer model, you actually end up with the joint likelihood over all the tokens that you've generated, or rather, more precisely, you get all the next token predictions at the observed token. So this is that first line. That's just the probability of the sequence that we've generated here. S is the sequence, X is the prompt. We don't care about the probability of the prompt. We just care about the probability of what we've generated given that prompt. And so for semantic entropy, what we would like to do is we would like to calculate the cluster probability. So how can we get the cluster probability? Cluster here being all the answers that the model could generate that have this particular meaning C. Well, in theory, it would be as simple as summing up all the generations in that cluster. And this is completely intractable because there are the space of generations is vast, and the best we can do is sample from it. But in theory, this is what we would like to do. And then in theory, computing semantic entropy would be as easy as just computing the entropy of the probability distribution over those cluster meanings. So we can't do this, but we can approximate it. And in particular, we have this kind of simple estimator that instead of requiring, we have the true probability over all the clusters, we just sample a bunch from the model, see how many clusters we get. And now what we need is an approximation of the cluster probabilities. And we have two estimators for getting this probability. Let's maybe start with the discrete one because it's really quite stupid, but works well. So the discrete estimator just says the probability of a cluster is given by the fraction of generations in that cluster. So let's say I generate 20 times, 5 out of the 20 generations belong to my first cluster. The probability of that cluster is 5 over 20. And this works really well, and you can use it with models that don't give you access to token probabilities. And I'm quite a fan of this. But we also have our default estimator that in certain situations can work better. And what that does is it takes the cluster probability as the cluster probability, which is, this is just the sum of all sample generations, that the sum of the probability of all sample generations in that cluster. So this is kind of doing this, but not over all generations, but just over the generations that we sample. And then we divide here, so we normalize this with the cluster probabilities of all the other clusters. This might seem a bit strange at first, you might be a bit confused as to why we have to do this. And that's because everything in LLMs is a bit hacky. One big problem with LLMs is that their generations have different lengths. And what this will mean immediately is that longer generations have lower probabilities, right? Because you have a product of probabilities here. If you add more to it, it can at best not get smaller, but usually probabilities will be less than 1. And so you end up in this annoying situation where any generation from the model that's longer will be less likely. But with LLMs, obviously that's not, this would be fine if you could do all this sampling and everything, but we can't. And so what people do in practice is they length normalize probabilities so that instead of ending up with this true joint, you get the average token probability. The averaging is usually done in log space, so it's it's an average in log space. But a really annoying consequence of this is that if you start summing probabilities, they can exceed 1. And you don't want probabilities to exceed 1. So we normalize here and we have something that can be interpreted as a probability. Cool. All right. So I think you've, sorry, can you still hear me? Okay. I think you've earned some results. So in terms of performance, we find that semantic entropy is able to improve on baselines across tasks and the different variants. And we're showing 2 metrics here. So first, we're showing the AUROC of predicting model accuracy. So we're using semantic entropy as a signal that predicts accuracy, like any classifier, except that the ground truth label is the model correct or not. And then we compute the ROC over that. And we also have the area under the rejection accuracy curve. So the idea here is you want to use your uncertainty signal to refuse to predict when the model is very uncertain. And then we measure how much can you increase accuracy by doing this. You have to choose some threshold at which you will refuse to predict. And the area under the rejection accuracy curve is the average accuracy you get when you refuse at all of the different possible thresholds. In terms of baselines, we have naive entropy here, which is just the token entropy. We have embedding regression, which is a simple linear probe trained to predict accuracy from hidden states. And you have p-true, which is a baseline from Anthropic, where they few-shot prompt the model with a bunch of different generations, and then ask the model to predict whether or not the input is a hallucination, essentially. So it's kind of in spirit similar to semantic entropy, but relies entirely on few-shot prompting. Yeah, and you can see that semantic entropy performs quite well. In particular, the discrete variant is almost as good as the non-discrete variant. I have the unaggregated version of this plot as well, where you can see all the different tasks. I'm not sure this is that interesting, but maybe you can look at it while I move on to the next slide. Cool. All right. So this is all nice and well for the sentence length generations, but as I alluded to earlier, that's not really how we use models anymore. And so obviously today, if you ask a model a question, it will give you this big paragraph. And so in the paper, we also attack hallucination detection for these paragraph length generations. And really what we do is the most straightforward thing that you could do. So we try to reduce the problem of paragraph length hallucination detection to sentence length hallucination detection. So the first thing we do is given this paragraph, extract all the facts in this paragraph. We use a prompt for this, and that works really well. Like for all the 150 facts we have, the decomposition with this prompt just grabbed them perfectly. I didn't see any errors there. What's more tricky is the next step. So now for every fact, we want to generate a question that leads the model to generate this fact again. So we've seen this with the Yarin Gal example. He has a startup, and now we want to probe if the model really knows the name of the startup. So we come up with a question so that the model is coaxed into giving us the startup name again. And so we do that here. So we generate a bunch of different questions, because one question isn't quite reliable enough, because it's actually quite tricky to write questions that are generic enough that they don't contain the answer, but specific enough so that the model actually responds with what you want it to. And then given those questions, we prompt the model answers, we sample model answers, and then we compute semantic entropy. And we average semantic entropy over all of the different questions that we generated, and that gives us an uncertainty signal for that fact. Yeah, and that's how you apply semantic entropy to paragraph length generations. It's really the simplest thing that anyone could do. It works quite well. It's again quite competitive with these baselines, but I definitely think this is an area of fruitful room for future research. There is one exception to what I just said, this like averaging semantic entropy. Sometimes models will refuse to answer. This is a thing that wasn't common at the time of that paper. Only GPT-4 sometimes did it, not reliably, but sometimes. And yeah, this changes the whole calculus of semantic entropy, right? If the model refuses to answer. So what we do here is we just say if the model refuses to answer too many times, so like more than half, we just say, okay, well, this is maximal uncertainty. The model doesn't know, and we know that it doesn't know not just from its uncertainty, but because it refuses to answer. So much for the Nature paper. I now want to talk about some follow-up work we did with Jiatong and Mo. Jiatong was a master student, really good master student. Mo is a colleague. And the motivation for this paper is that, You know, semantic entropy is cool, but it's super expensive. Like, you have to sample 5 to 10 extra inputs. You do not want to do that in practice. It's going to be really hard to convince people to do that in all but the most safety relevant applications. Like, this is literally a 5 to 10-fold increase of your serving cost. Like, that's a lot of money. And so we really think that what you need is a cheap approximation of you need a cheap proxy for uncertainty. What we do here is a cheap proxy of our semantic entropy. So we train super simple linear probes to predict semantic entropy from the hidden states of a single generation. So you no longer need to sample 5 to 10 times. You just generate once like you would usually. You apply this linear probe and you get your semantic entropy proxy. The cool thing here is that this is essentially free compared to the forward passes through the model. It's just one like simple linear layer. And we also don't need any accuracy labels to train this, because we don't train to predict accuracy. We train to predict semantic entropy, which we can compute just given a prompt, right? You just have to get a few prompts to get the model to generate. You can sample, you can compute semantic entropy. And this is exactly what we do. So given a set of inputs, we use these Q&A data sets. We ask the model to answer all the prompts, and then we compute semantic entropy. We store the hidden states, and then we can assemble this data set of hidden state semantic entropy pairs. And as I said, if you don't need accuracy labels, you can scale. We don't scale this, but you could scale this, and I think it would work a lot better because you don't need these accuracy labels, which you ultimately need from human supervision. And so given this data set, we train a logistic regression probe to just predict semantic entropy from the hidden states. We don't do regression, but we do classification. And we have this simple kind of regression tree-like split procedure for deciding globally what is low and what is high semantic entropy. I think if you would scale this to more labels, probably a regression model would work better. But for us, the classification worked better. There are 2 probing locations where we consider training the probe. The first one is at the token before the model generates, so just given the input question. And the second one is after the model has generated. The second last token, why not the last token? Because the last token is EOS, and by that point, the model doesn't care anymore. So you want to take the second last token or the token before the generation. Token before generation obviously is kind of interesting, like it's practical because you don't have to even generate, you can just refuse immediately. But it's also interesting how much the model knows about its uncertainty before it even starts generating. Yeah, we have a bunch of tasks, bunch of models that were all reasonable choices at the time. I think today you'd probably find some Chinese models in there. This work obviously also no relation to my work at FAIR. Yeah. So the metrics here are familiar because they're the same as in the Nature paper. And yeah, I think the results are kind of cool. So what you see here is you see the ROC of predicting semantic entropy. These are different probes trained at different layers of the model. And these are different tasks for which we train to predict semantic entropy. So we train the probes on the training set and then eval on the test set here. And each plot is a different model. Yeah, and what you can see is that you can definitely learn to predict semantic entropy from the hidden states. Obviously not perfectly, and obviously it works better for some tasks than for other tasks. But overall, it seems to be the case that whatever semantic entropy represents can also be found in the latent states of the model. It works better to predict it after generation, but it also works before generation. It also works for the longer generation scenario. So these aren't quite paragraph length generations, but they are significantly longer than just super short answers. And one cool experiment we did is to kind of see how well these probes generalize. And I'll soon argue that this is like their main advantage over competing approaches. But in this experiment here, what we do is for trivia QA, there's this context field. Like nowadays, people just use trivia QA as like a closed book exam. So you're given this question, and the model is supposed to answer it. But the data set actually also has context that contains the answer. So originally you would use it, you would use this context. You would give the model the context, you would give it the question, and then you would just kind of want the model to extract the answer from the context, which is a much, much easier task. And if you give this context, accuracy increases and uncertainty decreases. So we see this with semantic entropy. Like even given like a relatively bad model, as soon as we add the context, the accuracy jumps up, the semantic entropy goes down. And the cool thing is that if we apply our semantic entropy probes, we see the same behavior. So here you see the inputs without context, and you have fairly high semantic entropy and fairly high values for the probe. But then as you add the context, both kind of drop, at least on average. So that's kind of cool. But I think the really cool thing about semantic entropy probes is that they generalize better than accuracy probes. So accuracy probes here are our main competitor. And in domain, we can't really beat them. So in domain, meaning we train the probe on one data set and then evaluate on the test set of that data set. And here, I mean, I see this as kind of a win. The reviewers generally don't, but we work just as well as accuracy probes, even though we have not used any accuracy labels to train our probes. We just train to predict semantic entropy, and this works just as well for predicting accuracy as if you have an actual accuracy probe. So sometimes we're better, sometimes the accuracy probe is better. None of this is statistically significant, and so again, a win in my book, but alas, not everyone sees it that way. And now the cool thing, we generalize much, much better. So I think this is the only relevant scenario really, because you're not going to train probes on exactly the domains that you'll see in deployment. So I think what you really want is something that represents this inherent uncertainty signal. And what we find is that when we train semantic entropy probes on one domain and then apply them to another domain, that's where we really outperform the accuracy probes. So here, like, positive number means we're better than the accuracy probes. And I think this is like one standard error. So if 2 times this is larger than this, it's significant, something like this at a 5% level. You probably know what I mean. Yeah, so the semantic entropy probes generalize so much better to new domains than accuracy probes, which I think is really cool and was kind of the hope I had for these probes for the beginning. And unfortunately, I can just offer like speculations for why this is. I would really like to concretize these, but like my idea is that uncertainty is this inherent model property. And when you look at the latent space of the model, you should be able to find that signal. And so if you train a probe to predict the uncertainty, then hopefully the probe can find that direction in latent space that corresponds to this uncertainty. And then, you know, uncertainty will correlate with accuracy. If you have a decent uncertainty, the correlation won't be perfect. And so, you know, those probes will never be perfect for predicting accuracy, but hopefully they're pretty good at capturing this uncertainty signal. Okay, but what happens when you train a probe to predict accuracy instead of uncertainty? So with accuracy, you always have this competing signal, right? Yes, you could latch onto this uncertainty signal because that's okay for predicting accuracy signal, but there are so many competing factors that I think are quite attractive for the probe to latch on. Like, for example, you might learn that for BioAsk, which is like a medical data set, that your model cannot answer any questions about cancer. So that accuracy probe might be tempted, instead of listening only to the uncertainty signal, to also go into the cancer signal direction, which I'm sure exists in the latent space. But then that won't generalize, because the fact that the model doesn't know anything about cancer, that might only be for BioAsk, or only be for the difficulty of questions in BioAsk. That's kind of my speculation for why they're doing as well as they are. But yeah, it's speculation at this point. And so I think like the takeaway message here for me is that, you know, these probes aren't perfect. The performance is decent. And I think in particular, relative to how incredibly cheap they are, I think they are quite cool. But there is a gap to the much more expensive baselines. And I think closing this gap is really cool future work. that I'm probably not going to do, but maybe someone can do it, because we really have quite small data sets. And I truly believe that if you have more data, maybe you can train slightly more complicated probes. And I think that will get you to much, much better performance. Cool. Okay, so that's nearly it. I don't know. I haven't looked at the time once. But I guess at this point it's too late anyways. So wait, actually, how much time do I have? Because I can make this 30 seconds. I can make this up to 10 minutes. I think that's a bit of a stretch. That would probably be quite painful. But I do want to talk about like some more recent work that I've been involved in kind of in this direction. And also some things that I generally think are just cool directions if people here have an interest in doing research. I mean, I'm currently not working on this at FAIR, so I can just give these out. So one paper we've done with Aaron, another master student, it was on fine-tuning LLMs to abstain from prediction via semantic entropy. So the idea is to build an LLM that refuses to answer when it doesn't know. So instead of us having to sample, the idea is to kind of distill this semantic entropy signal into the model by collecting a data set where we compute semantic entropy, and then from that building a kind of fine-tuning data set where we try to teach the model to not answer and hope that this will then generalize to new prompts where semantic entropy would be high. That worked quite well, I think. Again, something where scaling might have probably helped, but difficult with university compute. There's some follow-up work on the semantic entropy probes from this time Jia Tong as first author, where he's looking at where he actually found that often in the semantic entropy probes, it's individual neurons that to a large degree correlate with the overall semantic entropy. So it might not even be necessary to train a full linear probe. Sometimes there are just individual neurons that contain that signal. There's some follow-up work to semantic entropy from Alexander, who reached out because it was his idea, and it was a really good idea, that our discrete clustering is quite extreme, because we say, generations, they have to mean exactly the same thing or they're in different clusters. And I've already talked about our kind of crutch of not doing full bidirectional entailment, but being fine if they don't contradict each other. But all of that is a bit unsatisfactory. And so what Alexander did is define a kernel over the generations that can directly reason about a kind of semantic distance between the generations. And that allows you to encode these more fine-grained signals about the semantic similarity. And so, yeah, his results show him outperforming the original semantic entropy. Then very recently, I think this might not be released yet, we applied semantic entropy with Jahan and some folks in Oxford who had access to a data set of questions about women's health. And the cool thing here is this data set was like nowhere on the internet. They were the only ones that had this data set. And they showed that semantic entropy can also be used quite reliably here to detect hallucinations. And this is always nice when you have a data set where you know it's not in the training data. And that's certainly the case here. And then there are two slightly more theoretical works. The first one with Andrew, where we're working on quantifying hallucination for in-context learning. In-context learning in particular is quite cool because it brings you so close to this formalism of standard supervised learning, but you can actually do all these things that you can't do with classic supervised models because you have a fully generative model over everything. And in kind of a similar vein, but actually completely unrelated to LLMs, but I think related in spirit, this paper here with Freddie on a new direction or perspective on uncertainties in not just language models, but overall machine learning. Cool directions for future work for, I guess, everyone interested. So one thing semantic entropy cannot do, but that is relevant in practice, There is also some work already out there that tackles this, but I think there's more to be done. At least there was more to be done when I last looked at this. Is accounting for aleatoric uncertainty in generations. And what I mean by that is essentially situations where there's multiple correct answers. So if you ask the model for a Beatles album, just because it gives you 2 different answers doesn't mean you shouldn't trust it. It just means there's multiple correct answers. And I think there are ways of dealing with this, but it makes things like a little bit more complicated. And then there's also what happens, the model can also give you a list of answers. There's all these like interesting variations on this. I think scaling up these probes is another direction. Another direction that's really, really promising, because I think they can be super powerful. In general, as I said, I'm super fascinated by why these uncertainties are so good. I think there's a bunch of possible explanations from which you can derive experiments that might be interesting to run. Like you could argue that these aren't like epistemic uncertainties at all. It's just, we've trained the model on everything. So everything is kind of in domains. Of course, it knows everything. And there might be ways to test that hypothesis. It could also be that, we just got kind of lucky with the architecture, and that this architecture is just, if you give it an input that's low density, let's say, in embedding space under the training data, that you just get outputs that are uncertain. There might be ways to then kind of test for that. I generally like data selection problems, and I think there's a lot of really cool active learning things you can do with transformer models, because you can simulate everything. Like in active learning, it's usually really annoying that you have to retrain models, and it's very expensive. You get like a new data point, you have to retrain the model. And if you now want to know how much better would this data point make my model if I would acquire it, that's a really complicated problem traditionally. But with LLMs, you can just condition on stuff. You can just put data points in the context. You can make up data points. You can do all of these really cool things that you can't do elsewhere. In the context of uncertainties and like hallucinations, I think at least like half a year ago, it was a bit of a wild west in terms of how do we evaluate this, and also how do we compare different methods. And there was such a rush to put out papers that at least at the time, and I don't know if it's been done now, but that we were really lacking like comprehensive comparisons of methods. So I think that's always, I feel like you can put this for almost any field, like almost any talk probably could have this point here. And yeah, uncertainty in reasoning. I mean, obviously reasoning is big, and I think based on some preliminary results we did, semantic entropy would work quite well for reasoning. And this is cool because things like retrieval will work much worse for reasoning. This is also cool because you can use, semantic entropy to, I don't know, filter your reasoning traces, do selection, and create, SFT data sets or environments for RL that are more likely to improve your model. So yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of cool things to do in the space of uncertainties and LLMs. And that is the end of my talk. So thank you very, very much for all coming. I hope I haven't bored you. Yeah, good to do that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jannik. We now have like 5 to 10 minutes for questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll give you the microphone. Okay, then let's start here.
Hi. My question is actually from a reverse direction. If an AI takes this document and it's actually trying to understand from its perspective, let's say it's trying to analyze it and it's trying to understand how much it can depend on this document to understand meaning, what would your perspective on it?
So you're asking that if I have a document and I'm asking the LLM to do something with it, how much can I trust the LLM's understanding of the document?
Like when I see this talk, I'm listening and I'm trying to analyze what it means and how does it logically makes all sense in my head, essentially. So if an AI takes this document and what you did your research. I'm just basically trying to understand how does your own work, like how does your work define, like how can classify or help understand. It's like a meta level of.
I think that's a question we try to stay clear of. I think it's probably not for me to. I think I'm really the wrong person to ask what it means to understand something. I think this is really something where we need more than computer scientists and physicists at the table. I would try to be quite practical about it. So if you can ask the model questions about the text, then you get consistent answers, that much what you would expect. That would be fine for me. But I think it's a very complicated question.
Okay, thank you.
So just a quick one. Hallucinations are an intrinsic part of LLMs, the way they work, right? So there's no way to avoid hallucinations, isn't there?
That's again almost a philosophical question. So I do not. I mean, it really depends. I don't know what you mean when you say they are an intrinsic part.
I'm asking this because it could be nice, and I think you're not the only one who said it. It could be nice if these models would just tell us, "Hey, you know what? I don't know the answer to your question."
Well, I know what you mean, but if you sample from these models with top P 95%, then that's actually not true. You just need the true answer to exceed probability of 95, and then your model never has to hallucinate. And even if you sample at a temperature of 1, I think there might be constructions where you can have the model like avoid giving you a wrong answer by just like creating like weird sentences that never end unless they end in the correct answer. That's probably like a little bit more theoretical. But yeah, I think like from a practical perspective, if you're talking about sampling and these models being probabilistic, I think maybe there's a theoretical argument that they will be like always epsilon hallucinate if you sample at temperature 1. If you sample at top P 95%, I don't think that's a concern. There's a different dimension here where the question is, can these models know everything? And I think there the answer is no.
No, of course. I was more in the, can they be aware that they don't know? And that's probably no.
Yeah, I think yes. I think because, that signal is in the latent space. So I think the models can be aware. I don't think this is something that comes out in normal training because you're just asking them to generate text from the internet or text from SFT datasets, or you're asking them to do RL. But I think you can make these models aware, and I think that's partly what we try to do in this work with Aaron, because obviously they have access to the latent space, and so I think they should have access to that uncertainty signal. But you would need some special training to make them aware.
And are you aware of any models? Sorry.
To share questions. Sorry, no.
Have you visualized maybe by color the uncertainty on a token level, and how is it to read it with the color like this?
Yeah, so I mean, I've actually dabbled a bit in token level uncertainties, and I think you can actually get a lot out of the token level uncertainties if you look at the right ones. Because if you think about like who's the president of the United States, and the model says the president of the United States is Barack Obama, then you don't really care about the uncertainties on any of the predictions except the one where it starts saying Barack, right? Because all the uncertainties before will mostly be about the syntax or lexis that you don't care about. But there's there's limitations to this. In particular, because if answers can be like those fundamental semantic tokens, they can be spread across multiple tokens, but then you always only have conditional predictions. There's things around like the order of answers Like if you're asking for the last 2 presidents and the model can give you Barack or Trump or Barack, then the semantic entropy would be fine, the entailment model would be fine, but token level uncertainties, now you can't differentiate between this. So I think token level uncertainties are interesting to look at, and you can probably get something quite usable out of them. And if you look at them, you will, like for this president question, you'll find that the first token will be quite uncertain because there's different ways of answering. Like it is Barack Obama, the president is, or just saying Barack straight away. I know it's not Barack Obama, I know, it's, you know, and then you'll find uncertainty kind of goes down as it settles into one answer, and then it'll become uncertain again if it's uncertain about the meaning. So yeah, I think token level uncertainties are good. I think people should look at them in general more, kind of appreciate that these are probabilistic models. I think that's something for people to look into like a little bit more.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This has been really interesting. I want to actually kind of take up on his last question and your answer to it. So, because it makes me think something else. Could some of the reason for the hallucinations be, to your first point, the vagueness of the way we're answering the question? As you can hear, I'm American. When you ask who's the president of the United States, 46 answers could be the right answer, because George Washington can still be the president of the United States, just not the current president of the United States. And there's this kind of vague, that is kind of vague. Are we maybe some ways for us to control it now, right? If we're not going to do, the semantic entropy kind of probing, right? Could it be better prompt engineering?
Yeah.
In that way?
I think you're pointing in a really interesting direction. So first, kind of from the perspective of the work we've done, we just assume that the questions are not ambiguous, and that the uncertainty we get is the uncertainty we care about. Actually, some of the questions are ambiguous, especially for these data sets that have been designed with context in mind. They will actually sometimes have something like, who's the president? But then they mean, the president of Kenya or the president of Germany and not of the US. And so from a practical perspective, the entire procedure still works. Because you get, ideally, you would get a model that then generates something diverse, and it probably wouldn't match the ground truth answer. So from a practical perspective, nothing breaks. But you are pointing at this very interesting point where there's a difference here, because the uncertainty arguably doesn't come from the model, but it comes from the prompt. And there is some work on making LLMs better question askers by trying to generate questions to which the answer you would expect to reduce uncertainty if you would condition on it and use it to generate future questions. Yeah, so I think that's a really important direction. And ideally, if there is a prompt from the user, you would like to be able to differentiate between if the model is uncertain and your question is ambiguous. Yeah, so I think that's another really cool direction.
Okay, do we have one more short question? Yes. Right there, okay.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you said the information about the uncertainty is basically in the latent space, right? And you have a way to label hallucinations in a sense. Do you see there being potential for doing supervised fine-tuning to then not answer? Because I think that sounds so straightforward and should be possible.
No, I think it's straightforward. I think it sounds possible. It's what we try to do here with Aaron in this paper. Although we don't use the latent state signal, we just use straight up semantic entropy, which is a bit more reliable. Yeah, I mean, I would hope that they're doing it at OpenAI or Google, or I mean, I don't know what they do at Meta, but I think this is clearly the, if I was in charge of a big post-training team, I would say 10% of our SFT data, we won't use it to fine-tune on it. We won't teach the model the ground truth, but will teach the model to understand its own uncertainty. I think this could be like quite a useful way, and it makes so much sense, right? You could use some data just to get the model to be aware of its uncertainty, rather than focusing everything on getting the most out of factual knowledge or general helpfulness and all of these things.
All right. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you for the great answers. Let's thank Jannik once again.